Hey there friends and folks, today I'm going to be showing you 3 different ways you can spice up your wire wrapped links. Playing with your wire wrapped links is such an easy way to add some personality and flair to any piece you're working on. And if you haven't mastered the basics of the wire wrapped link yet, you can find my tutorial for that linked in the description below. But if you're ready to start playing around, let's go! I'll also put timestamps in the description if you want to skip ahead to any particular wrap. But in the order I'll be demonstrating today, we have the messy or chunky wrap, the geometric wrap, and the spiral or orbit wrap. For today's techniques, we'll be using our chain nose pliers, round nose pliers, flat nose pliers, and wire cutters. I'll be demonstrating with these 15mm lapis rounds, and they all have pretty big holes, so I'll be working with this 20 gauge dead soft copper wire. First up, we have our chunky or messy wrap. For this wrap, you'll essentially be using an excess of wire to build up the presence of your links in as tight or messy a way as you want. I will usually utilize these bulkier wraps with bulkier beads, which is why these lapis babies are perfect for this. I'm going to start by cutting about 6 inches of copper wire. You can cut more if you want to build up your wraps more, but 6 inches should be enough for me to play around with for demonstration today. Now, as we do with our wire wrapped links, we're going to start by centering our bead on our wire segment. I'm going to create my first 90-degree bend off one side of the bead, and then I'm going to switch sides and bend the opposite tail about 2mm off that side. I'm leaving more space than usual because I'm using a thicker wire, so it's going to need more space for those wraps. Now that I have my 2 bends, both pointing in opposite directions, I'm going to go ahead and create my first loop. Using my round nose, I'll loop whichever tail I'm beginning with. I'm going to go ahead and create my second loop because building these loops together helps ensure consistency and symmetry. If you fully create one wrap and then start the other, you may accidentally create your first wrap too big, not leaving enough room for your opposite wrap, and then your whole link is off center. So now we have the foundation for both our loops, and I want to show you a more tightly coiled wrap as well as a looser, messier wrap, so I'm going to do one on one side and the other on the other. I'll wrap each tail 1 to 3 times, depending on how much space you have. Starting with our tight coil, we're going to coil our tails back up over the previous wrap and away from the bead. We're going to do this in a very controlled, tight manner as we did our first wrap, so each wrap sits snug against the previous. If you leave enough tail, you can even coil back downwards towards the bead after coiling up and continue this coiling back and forth till you get a link as thick as you want it. But for this example, I'm just going to be coiling up the once and then cutting and tucking my tail. Now that we've got our tight wrap, I'm going to do our messy wrap. So on this side, I have my base coil, and rather than tightly coiling the remainder of my tail, I'm going to purposefully create these kind of disconnected, overlapping, loose wraps. I'll wrap as many times as my tail allows, or until I've reached my desired size and then cut off the remaining tail. It's good to start with more wire than you think you'll need for the messy wrap because you're going to use your wire pretty liberally and it will run out on you a lot faster than you probably anticipate. It always does for me. But then I'll just find an open area to tuck my tail in as much as possible, and there you have it. These are 2 versions of basically the same wrap, but depending on how you build them, they have very different impact. I really love the look of this messy wrap, especially when it's oxidized. It's a great way to play up unique and larger beads. Next up, we'll go over this geometric wrap. This wrap really makes a statement and won't be a fit for every piece, but kind of along the same vein as utilizing chunky fashion chains and findings, this wrap has a time and a place. Essentially, you can make the loops of your wraps any shape or size that you want within reason. And if you're looking for something a little edgier than your standard round length, you can try this sucker out for size. So I've got my 6-ish inches of wire, and right off the bat we've centered our bead. When I go to create that first bend 2mm off our first side, instead of creating our usual 90-degree bend, we're going to angle the wire at about 45 degrees. Just like in our last wrap, I'm going to go ahead and create that opposite 45-degree bend now just to keep my bead in place. Then I'll go ahead and create the angles of these loops. This is where I'll use my flat nose pliers to create the 90-degree bends of this square link. Because the nose is so uniform, I can easily create each side of these loops the same length. As I work my way around, I'll want to make sure my tail is coming back and intersecting that original 45-degree bend so I can wrap it off and call it a day. So with a little poking and prodding, I've got my square link. Go ahead and create your square loop on the opposite side. Now I'll wrap it off and tuck that tail. Don't forget not to wrap your first loop too tight because you should still have space left on the opposite side for your opposite wrap. And there you have it, an easy way to create a geometric wrap using your flat nose pliers. And last but certainly not least, we have one of my favorite wraps. I've heard this referred to as a spiral wrap, but I also affectionately refer to it as the orbit wrap. This technique uses your remaining wire to actually spiral it around your bead or centerpiece and is super fun to play with, but of course we're starting out with the basics and using just our single beautiful lapis piece. In addition to this chunky lapis, we're going to be using about 8 inches of 20 gauge wire. Now I'll center my bead and create those first bends and loops. And it's really good to get in the habit of creating all your loops using the same motion so you have consistency and control. I know for myself, since I'm right-handed, I hold my wire in my left hand, and using my right, I create that 90-degree bend, loop away in a counterclockwise direction, and overlap my initial bend with the wire tail. This is important to remember because in order for your orbits to go in the same way, you want to be sure that when you create these initial bends and loops, you are going in the same direction and overlapping the base wire on the same side. So for example, I've created my first loop, then we'll take that loop in my left hand and create my second. You can see the loop is still running counterclockwise with the tail overlapping the base wire, and I'll create my second loop with the same exact motion so that it too is running counterclockwise and overlapping the base wire. Now that I've created my loops, I'll wrap each tail 1 to 3 times depending on how much space you have, until my bead is symmetrically locked in place. I'll make sure these coils are tight and then go ahead and start my orbit wrap. Holding with my left hand, I'll use my fingers to guide the left hand tail around my bead, following the directions of my initial coil. You can orbit as many times as you wish, but usually I only orbit once or twice. And there you have your first spiral. You'll create your second using your first as a guide. You'll coil following the same motion and direction as your first coil. You can kind of poke it and prod it until it's in position and then secure it with a tight coil around the opposite wrap. And there you have it. You've created a spiral wrap, or an orbit wrap, or whatever you feel like calling it. There's so many names for so many things. We're just here to have fun. And there you've got your free alternative wire wrapped links. I would love to know about your favorite ways to spice up basic techniques, and if you try any of these out, I would love to see them on Instagram. Of course, please let me know if you have any questions down below, and I will do my very best to answer them. Thank you all so much for tuning in. Until next time, take care and bead well.